Welcome to this week's Miller's Movers. Hope you all had a good Easter, and of course with Easter the main jumps focus over the weekend was at Fairyhouse in Ireland, and there's a few races I think are worth just touching upon. First one I want to touch on is the performance of Mirazur West, who on my social timeline a lot was made of this performance, that he was taking a massive step forward and was a really exciting horse to follow forward next year. I mean, perhaps partly driven by Willie Mullins saying he could be a very exciting horse for novice chasers next year, which of course he could well be. But I do think this was a bit of an overreaction. Yes, it was his best performance over hurdles so far, but that is in context of the fact he's turned into some absolute stinkers where he's jumped poorly and pulled far too hard. In the second time hood, he did settle far better and his jumping was much, much better. But we need to put a bit of context on this performance. He beat Facile Mode 6 lengths. That's the same Facile Mode that was 50 lengths behind Corporal Potter at Leopardstown at Christmas, and then in the region of 40 lengths behind Ballyburn at the Dublin Racing Festival, 33 lengths behind Slade Steel. That gives you some sort of guide as to what level Mirazur West has run to. Yes, he's an exciting horse. He's a good-looking horse. He jumped very well and he looks scopy, so he might well be better over fences, but I think we ought to all not get too carried away with exactly what he achieved on the bare facts of it. A horse that is very exciting as well in the JP McManus colours is Spillanes Tower. And he won and got the better of Blood Destiny for the second time of their three matchups. The 2 mile 4 trip at Fairyhouse on the heavy ground really suiting him. Blood Destiny again confirming that he just doesn't stay this trip on heavy ground. 2 mile 4 just stretches him. He did get the better of Spillanes Tower over 2 miles on heavy ground, so the ground is not an issue in itself for Blood Destiny, but Spillanes Tower is clearly the strongest stay, and I think he'll stay further. Could well be a horse that's up to graded contests over 3 miles into next season. Maybe live outsider for the Cheltenham Gold Cup, perhaps. A horse that avoided Cheltenham this year, but certainly showed the benefit of that, was Bottler'secret for Gavin Cromwell. He won the juvenile hurdle and did so in good style. Raced up with the pace, so I think the fact he did that needs to upgrade his performance. He was on the sharp end the whole way through. Certainly the Willie Mullins horse that finished third came from a long way back. And on the bare form of it, it looks like he's run to around about a mark of 138, maybe even 140. That puts him within £5-7 of Masborough, who won the Triumph Hurdle. I think Bottler'secret is certainly well up there with this year's juveniles. For all that I would say, I think they are perhaps a slightly subpar bunch. Masborough is probably going to go over fences next year. Bottler'secret does look like an out-and-out hurdler, but I don't see anything from the juvenile division this year shaking up the champion hurdle picture and the grade ones next year. One thing I did write about this weekend in my Racing TV piece was that we'd like to see more British trainers heading over to Ireland and taking them on, and there was much made of the fact that there weren't enough horses to go around for us to even entertain sending horses over to the Irish National. I think that was a bit wide of the mark. Certainly the way the weights were framed, top weighting of 148 in the Irish National, there's surely plenty of horses that could have gone for that if Connections had perhaps had the foresight to consider it as an option. Brewin'upastorm, Ollie Murphy sent him over and he landed the grade 2 hurdle in good style over 2 mile 4 furlongs. It was a good performance. He's not a top-notch horse. His last win came a year ago at Fontwell in the Game Spirit, another grade 2. But he went over there and he got the job done. And hopefully this will encourage, Ollie Murphy's sort of endeavours will have encouraged other British trainers to take stock, and maybe this next year we'll have a few more horses in Ireland from the UK, and maybe even some might dare to go to the Dublin Racing Festival and mix it up there. 10 years ago on this card, Unas Tiste won a grade 3 mare's chase, and her son yesterday, Intense Raffles, ran out a very good winner, I thought, of the Irish National. Tipped up on the SBK betting podcast. My one concern was that perhaps being on the front end all the way through and racing prominently might perhaps harm his chances, but it didn't at all. He travelled very, very sweetly, and despite making a very bad mistake far from home, where though he got his landing gear down, he sort of got knocked sideways, lost plenty of momentum. I think on heavy ground, it's to his credit he was able to get back on the bridle pretty quickly and then sustain a good challenge from the runner-up all the way to the line. He is potentially, well, I mentioned on Saturday, I said that I thought he was a grade 1 horse in a handicap, and I think that runs true. I think he's a really high-class prospect. He's only 6 years old, had very good form early on in France before losing his way. Thomas Gibney has clearly found the key to him, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see him perhaps come over for the Charlie Hall chase. maybe even the Betfair chase at Haydock. I think this is a smart horse in the making, potentially a Grand National horse one day, but he's just 6 years old and clearly firmly on the upgrade. Into handicap moves and shakers now, as ever, horses going up in the handicap, horses coming down in the handicap, and this week as well, a few horses that haven't had their mark adjusted, and I think that means they remain on a fairly competitive mark. So horses going up, and the first one I want to speak about is the Ben Pauling train, Samuel Spade. Ben Pauling, I don't remember him having a quiet month this season. He's in his new yard now, second season in his new yard, seems to have found the trick to keeping his horses healthy all the way through. And Samuel Spade won at Huntingdon last Monday. It's gone up £5 to a mark of 127, but it was a really impressive performance. His jumping still leaves a little bit to be desired at times. He can be a bit slow and a little bit awkward. And Beau Morgan, who rode him on this occasion at Huntingdon, had him situated fairly wide to the left-hand side of the right-handed track at Huntingdon, going down the back. The final hurdle, he fiddled it and jumped away to his left, forfeited ground. Briefly looked like he was in a little bit of trouble, and Beau Morgan had to get quite busy to get him to latch back onto the main group. But he then travelled very powerfully into contention, quick and smartly between the second last and the last, and really cleared away going to the line, stayed on very, very powerfully. I don't think this mark of 127 has caught up with him at all. He has been kept to right-handed tracks throughout his career. He's only run once left-handed and did run poorly, but that came at a time when he was struggling to adapt to this new discipline, so I wouldn't hold a left-hand track against him, but they seem committed to running him right-handed. I do wonder whether the 2 mile 4 handicap at Sandown on the final day of the season would suit this horse very nicely indeed on that stiffer track, given how well he stayed over the 2 mile 4 at Huntingdon. But £5 up to a mark of 127, I don't think that would stop him at all. I'd be really keen to see Beau Morgan keep the ride. Obviously, if he comes off and a non-claiming rider comes back on, I would want to factor that into his chances, because I think Beau Morgan is excellent value for his claim. Another hurdler who's gone along really well this season is Brentford Hope, and he won in very ready style at Haydock at the weekend. It's now up £5 to a mark of 145. That's a fairly big rise of £5, given that he only won by a diminishing length at the line from Holly. But he travelled like much the best horse through the race. I think, given his time again, Paul O'Brien would probably take a bit more of a pull turning in. He got to the front, travelling very cosily, and I think actually just eyed a little bit after the last, which allowed Holly to close right up. He was, or is, rated 100 on the flat, but he has been as high as 107 in his time. As a general rule, you can add about 40 to a horse's flat rating to get the level they might be capable of over hurdles. Brentford Hope has been a bit of a slow burner. I think his opening mark was something like 117, and he's gradually progressed from there since switching to the Harry Durham yard from Richard Hughes. But 145, I think, still doesn't touch him. His jumping is improving all the time. I think he could be potentially a 150 horse, potentially a low-graded horse in time. He was beaten off 127 in last year's Swinton Hurdle. So obviously an £18 higher mark doesn't scream as being a gift this time around, but I don't think you can put a value on the experience this horse has gained since being with Harry Durham. And if he were to go to the Swinton Hurdle, even off a mark of 145, I think he would have to be of real consideration, given that he is still clearly improving with every single run. One of the good results of the weekend for SBK Betting Podcast followers was Numitor, who was my nap for the weekend, ran out a very ready winner of the Veterans Chase at Haydock. Despite that coming just 11 days after his reappearance run at Exeter, I was slightly concerned about that, but he seemed to show no ill effects whatsoever and won very cosy under Sean Bone, despite the fact that the third from home and the second from home, he made very slow, moderate jumps, seemed to lose a lot of momentum, seemed to lose a lot of focus, but didn't have to be pushed out to win this. He's gone up now £6 to a mark of 135. That's a fair rise, I think. I don't like seeing these veterans get bumped up sort of large margins for winning what essentially are weaker races, given that they're racing against veterans. But that said, this time last year, he was second to Cheltenham, who's now rated 142. He was trying to give him £12 at Newbury. They pulled 20 lengths clear of the third horse. So I don't think a mark of 135 is beyond him. He does need soft ground, or certainly ground with cutting it. And I wouldn't want to see him turned out again quickly now by Heather Main and have a third run in a short space of time. So it might be that he doesn't get his conditions again this season, but If the rain continues to fall, and it seems to have done it for about the last 6 months solid, Numitor can be found a contest over 2 mile 4 on soft ground. I don't think a mark of 135 is beyond him, and maybe he'll be able to carry his form through into next year, where of course he will be that little bit older as a veteran, but Numitor still fairly lightly raced. I think a mark of 135 is still workable for him. Couple of horses going down now, and two actually from the same race. The first one is the Emma Lavelle trained Dream in the Park. He's gone down £1 to a mark of 110 for finishing 4th at Ascot last Sunday. That was his first start for 115 days after he'd disappointed at Taunton, where the jockey reported he stopped very suddenly. Now, he does like good ground, so whether it's that he was kept away from the testing ground through the winter, or whether it was that after that run at Taunton something came to light and he'd been kept off the track. But he was briefly outpaced at Ascot turning in, and then stayed on nicely, not in spectacular form. He wasn't a huge eye catcher, but he stuck to his task really well. Clearly likes good ground. He won both his hurdle races last season on a good ground surface, and I think he'll stay a little bit further than this 2 mile 5 as well. Down now to a mark that's £6 below his hurdle mark. I think a mark of 110 looks certainly workable, and I'd be very disappointed if Emma Lavelle doesn't keep him on the go and can't find him one, or if not two, winning opportunities in the not too distant future. Also in the same race was Hurlerontheditch. He's gone down £1 as well to a mark of 116. Now this is the second time he's featured in Handicap Movers and Shakers. The first time was when he was very unfortunate to get a £10 rise for falling at the final fence at Warwick, when he was looking like a wide margin winner. I said on that occasion that I didn't think the £10 mark would stop him, providing that fall didn't have any ill effects. It transpired that perhaps that fall did knock his confidence, because he was disappointing on his next 2 starts, finishing stone last on one of those starts. But he's since had a wind up, and I just wonder whether that fall at Warwick, which if you go back and watch was quite unusual, seemed to jump the fence absolutely fine and then knock on a landing and sort of topple over. I wonder whether, given the fact that he's had a wind up, whether actually he was a very tired horse and just simply didn't have enough oxygen in his lungs to stand up after the last at Warwick. He looked to me at Ascot to be ridden to finish his race off. He was given plenty to do and finished very, very powerfully from the back of the second last to the last and then the last of the line. That's going to give him plenty of confidence. Now down to a mark of 116, having been as high as 122. I think he's a well-handicapped horse, and I think provided he can go up in trip, again a horse that perhaps wants a little bit of cut in the ground. He wouldn't want summer ground by any means, but I'm sure Kim Bailey, who's coming right back into form now, can find him a race before the end of the season off a mark of 116. One of my disappointing selections from the weekend was Ballygeary, who I quite liked in the race that was won by Brentford Hope, but he jumped very, very poorly under Peter Kavanagh. Not in as that he was making mistakes, but just that his head came up very high, and no matter what stride he was on, he seemed to come out the hurdle the other side having lost lengths. Whether it was just a miscommunication between him and Peter Kavanagh, and they just never looked particularly comfortable with each other, I'm not so sure. The ground, perhaps on the hurdle track, was riding a little bit quicker than it was on the chase track. Maybe that would sort of had him a little bit uncomfortable, but it was noted that his best run at Kelso, or the run that caught my eye at Kelso in the Moor Battle Hurdle, was under Brian Hughes. Brian Hughes is famous for having an excellent pair of hands, very soft hands. Whether that Ballygeary is just a little bit sensitive in his mouth and him and Peter Kavanagh clashed, I'm not sure, but I would be keen not to give up on Ballygeary. I'm always happy to give a horse one poor run. This was undoubtedly poor, but he's down £1 to a mark of 117. I would certainly be interested in him going forward, and even more so if Brian Hughes to regain the ride and use his magic hands to perhaps cajole Ballygeary forwards and elicit a better jumping performance. And then one final horse, and it's a veteran that's coming down in the handicap, is Ligerian. He's down £3 now to a mark of 128. He didn't figure behind Numitor at the weekend, but the soft testing ground, it was reported to be gluey and holding ground, wouldn't have suited him at all over a trip of 2 mile 4 furlong. He's gone really well for Joe Tizard. He's won plenty of races. He goes very well on good ground over 2 mile 4. This is coming into his time of the year now. A £3 rise is a drop, I should say, is the most he's been dropped in recent times. A mark of 128 certainly is workable for him, and I'm sure Joe Tizard will find a race for him in the not too distant future. And to finish with, one horse that's a non-mover, and that's Don't Tell Sue, who finally shed his maiden tag at Wincanton last week, easily landing 1 to 4 on odds. but he's taken a long time to shed that maiden tag. He's been a little bit disappointing, and certainly his last couple of runs he's looked very immature. But at Chepstow on his hurdle debut, he looked pretty composed. He was beaten just 2 lengths by Manella Missile. Manella Missile then went on to Cheltenham to win a graded race, beating a stablemate of Don't Tell Sue in Captain Teague. Manella Missile is rated 138. Don't Tell Sue remains unchanged on the mark of 117, was just 2 lengths behind him. I wouldn't hold his couple of runs where he's looked a bit green against him. I think he's a horse that's going to be better in a better grader race. I think a mark of 117. Paul Nicholls looking to try and fire Harry Cobden to a first Jockeys Championship. Sure, Don't Tell Sue will be kept on the go. There's some quite nice handicap pots coming up now at the likes of Ayr and Sandown. I think Don't Tell Sue the novice off a mark of 117 could certainly make his presence felt. So that's the end of this week's episode. I'll be back next Tuesday, looking forward to the Aintree Festival, so I'll perhaps try and have a dig back through some of the previous marks, try and find a few horses that look well handicapped going into Aintree. As ever, if you've got any questions, particularly heading into the couple of final spring festivals at Ayr and Aintree, do send them my way and I'll endeavour to deal with them next week.